issue of marriage, divorce, and remarriage is primarily a question of law, and the Bible has much to say on this topic. The Bible has the ultimate law in it. Even in the Ten Commandments, it speaks of this when it says, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," and "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife." So, the issue of marriage is very fundamental to biblical law, and it's something that is valid today. Some people think of biblical law as being somewhat antiquated, but Christ speaks of it as being relevant to the end of time. Matthew 5:17, he says, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled. Whosoever shall break one of these least commandments, and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say unto you, that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven." Now the scribes and Pharisees had an external righteousness based upon human tradition that essentially nullified the validity of the law of God. They followed the teachings of the Babylonian Talmud, which gave all kinds of exceptions and loopholes that basically allowed for them everything that was expressly prohibited. So they found a way to get around the law against adultery, and they just used the loophole of divorce and remarriage. If they wanted another woman, they would just divorce this one, marry the next, and it was all good on paper, as it seemed. You know, in Moses, they did say that divorce and remarriage was allowed. In Deuteronomy 24:1, it says, "When a man hath taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he hath found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement, and give it into her hand, and send her out of his house. And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife." Now, they would debate what some uncleanness meant. Was it because the wife had been unfaithful, or just merely because she burned the dinner? There were two schools of thought on this. The school of Shammai said it was only for adultery that a man could divorce his wife, while the more liberal school of Hillel said just about any reason you could come up with is uncleanness and you can divorce your wife. And so the Pharisees came to test Christ on this very point. And the most relevant passage on this is in Matthew 19:3-9. "The Pharisees came unto him, tempting him, and saying unto him, Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? And he answered and said unto them, Have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh? Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. They say unto him, Why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement, and to put her away? He saith unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say unto you, Whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her which is put away, doth commit adultery." So when they sought to question him as to what a person could put away his wife for, they expected something along the lines of for adultery or for any other reason. And he comes back and blows them both away and says, basically for no reason whatsoever. What God has joined together, let not man put asunder at all. And so this is very strange. This is different than the teachings of Moses. And he says, yeah, it is. I abrogate the teachings of Moses. And he appealed to the overriding precedent of creation. Marriage was instituted in creation as part of natural law. It's not merely a prescription over time and tradition, but it's something fundamental to our very nature. It's who we are. We were made male and female. This is part of what humanity is. And this is what Christ appeals to. He says, Have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh? Of course, he's quoting from Genesis 2:24. So this is not a mere legal contract. This is something that is part of the physical universe of who humanity is. And when we see the institution of marriage in creation, we see what a valid marriage essentially consists of. Of course, mankind was created male and female, not male and male, or female and female. So homosexual marriage is really no marriage at all. And it says a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. There's one transition here. Leaves father and mother and is joined to wife. He doesn't leave one wife and go to another wife. And he's joined to his wife, not the wife of another man. And it's a man and his wife, singular, not men or wives, plural. And he says, and they twain shall be one flesh. So there's only two here, one man, one woman. And so that essentially abrogates the practice of polygamy. Now in the Old Testament, polygamy was conceded to and allowed for the patriarchs and certain Jewish royalty. It was something that happened in the ancient world and said, God winked at these things. But Christ abrogates that practice and appeals to creation and essentially disallows polygamy from the time of Christ forward. And he says, and they twain shall be one flesh. It's only two here. Now, when they become one flesh, this is not merely a legal contract written with pen and ink. This is woven into their very being. This is part of their nature. The man and woman become one flesh. It's a contract that's written in flesh and blood. And it's something that's valid as long as both are in the flesh. That is, as long as both are in the body, till death do them part. And adultery was a sin punishable by death. It's punishable by stoning. So this is a very, very serious matter. And when it says they become one flesh, it's not merely speaking of the sex act. It's talking about procreation. Because a man and a woman become one flesh when their genes are knit together in the formation of a child. So a child is an inseparable union of the flesh of his father and his mother. And so marriage is an inseparable union in the eyes of God. So Christ abrogates the teachings of Moses and appeals to the overriding precedent of creation, essentially disallowing divorce altogether when he says, what God has joined together, let not man put asunder. But then, in the same passage, he says, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. Now this exceptive clause is very key. We need to know what this means exactly to know whether it is permitted to divorce and remarry in certain circumstances. Now the word Christ used here in this except it be for fornication is the word porneia. This is where we get the word pornography. And it means sexual immorality in a general sense. Now, different Bible versions render this differently. The King James Version renders it as fornication. And the New International Version renders it marital unfaithfulness. And the English Standard Version renders it as sexual immorality. And these are basically the three main themes. It's rendered as fornication, or marital unfaithfulness, or sexual immorality. Now, the modern English meaning of fornication is premarital sex. And this is a little unfortunate. The word fornication, the meaning of the word has changed over the years. So that the modern English meaning of premarital sex is a little bit different than the Old English version, which had a more general connotation. But anyway, some people interpret the fornication, the exception clause as fornication, due in part to these Bible translations that renders fornication. They understand that to mean premarital sex. And this is, the idea here is that a man marries a woman and she comes into and finds that she's not a virgin, and therefore he has a right to divorce her and marry someone else. This is from the book of Deuteronomy 22:13. It says, if any man take a wife and go in unto her and hate her, and give occasions of speech against her, and bring up an evil name upon her, and say, I took this woman, and when I came to her, I found her not a maid. Now, if this was found out to be true, she was put to death. She was stoned. The punishment was the same as adultery. And so this was taken very seriously. This is, the marriages in those days were arranged marriages. Marriages were arranged for the children by their parents. And the marriage was considered binding even before it was consummated. So, children, even before marriageable age, a boy might refer to a girl as being his wife, even before they had come together. And when they did come together, if she was found not to be a virgin, this was a punishable offense. This was considered as serious as adultery. So there's also another story in the New Testament where speaks of the situation with the Virgin Mary being with child by the Holy Spirit. Joseph, misunderstanding this, seeks to divorce her. In Matthew 1:19, then Joseph, her husband, being a just man, and not willing to make her a public example, was minded to put her away privily. So he was planning to divorce her, and that was the just thing to do, because he misunderstood. He thought she had committed fornication, but in fact, of course, she had been impregnated by the Holy Spirit. But this was kind of thrown back in the face of Christ. He's debating with the Jews in a rancorous debate, and they revile him, and they say, "We be not born of fornication," that's porneia. "We have one Father, even God." It's from John 8:41. Sort of implying that, Christ was born of fornication. They're implying this because, of course, he was born before his mother and father came together. If you're not talking about his father, but Joseph, before Joseph and Mary came together. So the implications are such that someone might consider premarital sex as just grounds for divorce and remarriage, even after the marriage has been consummated. And this would be sort of unfortunate if someone could hold this over someone's head as, because you had sex before we were married, therefore it's okay for me to divorce and remarry you later. Of course, this shouldn't be applicable after the wedding night. But anyway, this is what some people try to interpret this as. But this would give widespread license for divorce and remarriage because premarital sex is so common in today's culture. So this would give an excuse to just about anyone that had, I can divorce because, my spouse was guilty of having premarital sex. So this would not be divorce and remarriage in the way that we understand, but rather a broken engagement prior to a first marriage. This is not, they're not violating the marriage afterwards. This is something that it only happens in the beginning. So the word fornication means more than simply premarital sex. The English word fornication is derived from the Latin word fornicatio, which has a root word fornix, which means an archway. Back in Roman times, an archway designated a house of prostitution. So fornication implies prostitution or whoredom. Indeed, that's used in the context of Bible versions that translate porneia as fornication. It's speaking of prostitution. In 1 Corinthians 6:16 it says, "What? Know ye not that he which is joined to an harlot is one body?" The same passage says, "Flee fornication," porneia, referring to being joined to an harlot. So it's talking about prostitution. And then another place in Jude 1:7 it says, "Even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication," which is a derivative of porneia. And we know what kind of fornication Sodom and Gomorrah were having. That was homosexuality. So porneia can refer to prostitution, can refer to homosexuality, also can refer to incest. In 1 Corinthians 5:1 it says, "It is reported commonly that there is fornication among you, and such fornication as is not so much as named among the Gentiles, that one should have his father's wife." Apparently a man in the early church had married his mother-in-law, and this is a prohibited form of incest under Levitical law. So porneia can mean incest. It can also mean idolatry. God uses the word porneia to refer to the unfaithfulness of Israel, his wife, in a figurative sense, when Israel goes a-whoring after other gods, committing fornication. Also in Revelation 19:2, speaking of mystery Babylon, it says, "He hath judged the great whore, which did corrupt the earth with her fornication." Of course, a whore implies whoredom. So fornication really means, in Old English, means whoredom, which is translated as whoredom in Young's literal translation. So you can't simply take the modern English meaning of premarital sex and put it in there and then pull it back out again and say, "I know what this means. This means premarital sex." When in fact, in the context of the Bible and in the original languages, fornication means sexual immorality in a general sense. Now, some other versions render porneia as marital unfaithfulness. This is a deliberate mistranslation in order to give license to the widespread practice of divorce and remarriage. It's wholly unjustified by the context. So, of course, when people divorce, unfaithfulness is commonly involved. And so this provides a huge loophole for people to divorce and remarry because, "Oh, my wife was unfaithful." Or they even imply that when they're divorced, even unfaithfulness was not involved during the divorce. If the first one to get married, the first one to remarry is guilty of adultery, while the person who remarries a day later is absolved. So the implications are absurd, but in the context, it's the different word. The word porneia means sexual immorality. The word for marital unfaithfulness is moikaia, a different word. So Christ uses the same word in the same sentence, he uses moikaya, makes a deliberate distinction. Christ is very deliberate about the words he uses and very precise. He's not just muddling through here. Every word he says has importance. He says, whoever shall put away his wife, except it be for porneia, and shall marry another, committeth moikaya. He could have, if he had meant marital unfaithfulness, he would have used moikaya both. He could have used moikaya both times. So they're not mere synonyms. They are different words and they have different meanings. In another place, Christ makes a distinction between the specific sin of moikaya, or adultery, and porneia, or fornication. Matthew 15:9, he says, for out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications. It's moikaya, porneia, two different things in the same list. Also, the Apostle Paul in Galatians 5:19, he says, now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, moikaya, fornication, porneia. So these are not the same things. The implications of rendering porneia as marital unfaithfulness is a modern innovation that is more of an interpretation than a translation, which is very unfortunate because it gives widespread encouragement to the practice of divorce and remarriage in today. And it's partly because the way people think in modern times about marriage, they think of marriage as being something that's pure and holy in the beginning, but then if later, if marital unfaithfulness or immorality is introduced, like a fly in the ointment, the marriage is spoiled and ruined and it's null and void and it's time to throw it away and buy a new one. Maybe it's worth fixing, maybe it isn't, but it's your choice to do whatever you want to fulfill your own selfish desires. So it's kind of pandering to a modern way of thinking, and it's inconsistent with the biblical worldview. So in conclusion, porneia is not merely premarital sex, as fornication would imply, and it's not merely marital unfaithfulness, as some version would render it, but it would be properly translated as sexual immorality. It's a general term that refers to immorality in general. So how do these statements then fit together? When Jesus says, what God hath joined together, let not man put asunder, like as if there was no exception, no reason that a person could divorce his wife and marry another. But then in the same passage he says, whoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. Where is the exception? Well, the exception is in what God hath not joined together. What God hath not joined together, man might rightly put asunder. And there are all kinds of ways in which people can become one flesh that are not sanctioned by God, that are not according to his law, and that should not be preserved. So, but if God has joined together the marriage, a marriage that God has joined together at some point in time does not cease to be a marriage that God has joined together at some later point in time, merely because unfaithfulness or immorality is introduced. It all depends on what the original marriage is like. So, what if the exception for fornication does not refer to something outside the marriage, coming in and wrecking it, but to something inside the marriage? That is, to the marriage itself. What if the marriage itself is porneia? Then it should be put asunder, and one may even be able to remarry in that circumstance. So, what would be an example of an illegitimate marriage, where the marriage itself is porneia? Using these different things we can understand for the word porneia, prostitution? Nobody would ever call prostitution marriage, would they? Well, in Islam, they make a provision for temporary marriage or contract marriage, which is like prostitution, but normally we don't hear that. Nobody would ever refer to homosexuality as marriage, would they? Well, in a generation past, that may well have been true, but lo and behold, in our modern day, abominations abound. Or incest, no one would ever call that marriage, but, there was that situation in the Bible where a man married his mother-in-law. Or polygamy, polyandry, group marriage, open marriage, women who act as concubines or mistresses. There are many things like this that could be porneia, but we don't commonly call them marriage. They may in some circumstances be called marriage, but it's not common to call them marriage. But what is the most common form of an illegitimate marriage? It's an unoriginal marriage, a second marriage, a third marriage. This could very well be what Christ was referring to. Many in his audience would have been remarried, it was very common in his day as it is in ours, and it was a common way in which they found a way to circumvent the prohibition against adultery and coveting their neighbor's wives by just divorcing and remarrying someone else. So when Christ makes an exception as if the marriage itself is sexual morality, it would most likely refer to second marriages, unoriginal marriages. It would fit right into the context. And if you read this back in to interpret it in such a way, it sounds like this. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be that their marriage is itself immoral, because she is not his legitimate wife, and shall marry another, commits adultery. And whoso marries her which is put away, commits adultery. So if you are in an illegitimate marriage, which is itself immoral, you should divorce, and maybe even potentially have an opportunity for remarriage there. Consider a homosexual marriage. We would not consider that a marriage, but yet it is called marriage. It takes a form of marriage. And what if two homosexuals would realize that their involvement was wrong, repent of their sin, and seek to amend the situation? What need they do? Well, they need to divorce. And could they remarry? Well, they could essentially marry for the first time, because what they had wasn't marriage at all. They should go out and get married, that is, to someone of the opposite sex. So having a marriage that is itself immoral is the first reason why we should consider that there is an exception here. Divorce is allowed, and potentially even remarriage. Now, most people think, oh, divorce, God could never allow divorce. Divorce is bad, divorce is evil. We hate divorce, right? Well, the modern way of thinking, divorce is bad because it's so painful, it's so inconvenient, it's so traumatic, it's so difficult. But remarriage is kind of a good thing, because then you have some restoration of a marriage, of comfort and happiness and these things. But from God's perspective, divorce can be a good thing if it puts an end to an immoral union. And remarriage can be a bad thing if it institutes an immoral union, especially under the cloak of form and of marriage, under humanistic law. So what we're calling about is essentially, this is like an annulment. You would essentially render the first marriage as invalid because it was immoral. Maybe it was a second marriage, maybe it was an immoral union of some kind, and it should be annulled and rendered null and void. And it might potentially provide an opportunity for someone to remarry if they do not have a former spouse still living. Now, of course, in a remarriage situation, at least one of the spouses would have a former spouse still living. So the first case in which divorce and potentially remarriage would be allowed is if the marriage itself is immoral. There is a second reason for divorce mentioned in the Bible, and that's the departure of the unbeliever. The Apostle Paul spells this out in 1 Corinthians 7:12 when he says, But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath a husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called it to peace. So a brother or sister is not under moral obligation to forcefully prevent the marriage from being dissolved, but can peacefully allow it to happen. So when it says we're not under bondage. But many people say, oh, that I'm not under bondage means I'm not bound. That means I'm loose. That means I'm free to remarry. But in the context of the same passage, this is not permissible. The basis for this interpretation, that I'm not bound, therefore I'm loosed, comes from 1 Corinthians 7:27, where it says, Art thou bound to a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. But and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned, and if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. The words bound and loosed should be kept in the proper context here. Loosed in this passage does not necessarily mean loosed by divorce. It means loosed by death, because this passage was addressed to widows and virgins, because it says in 1 Corinthians 7:8, I say therefore to the unmarried and widows. It's not addressed to divorced persons. So those who are loosed in the situations are loosed through death. And remarriage is not necessarily recommended by the Apostle Paul, but it's allowed. So that it says they are not under bondage does not mean they are free to remarry. In the same passage, 1 Corinthians 7, it is spelled out that they are bound for the law for life. In 1 Corinthians 7:39, the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. But if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. So while divorce might be allowed in such a case, remarriage is not, unless, of course, the death of the former spouse intervenes. The only options are to remain unmarried or to be reconciled to your former spouse, which is what it says in 1 Corinthians 7:10. And to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. But and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. So these are the two options. You can remain unmarried, you can be reconciled to your former spouse. There is no third option. You can't marry another in this situation. So while divorce might be allowed, remarriage is not. And to make it redundantly clear, in Romans 7:2, he addresses the same issue. He says, for the woman which hath a husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. So then, if, while her husband liveth, she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. So we are only loosed and free to remarry only by the death of a former spouse, not by divorce. So, if this is the case, there are numerous objections to this interpretation. There are so many that I cannot even go into them. Every time I think I've heard them all, I hear a new one. So there's 1,001 reasons that the rational mind can come up with about how it's okay for me in this circumstance and because of this, and it's okay for me because of this. Well, I'll just address 3 of these in the interest of brevity. So, some people say, well, this is the law is all well and good, but, aren't we free from the law because we're under grace? So we don't have to worry about the technicalities of what God's law says? Well, this is addressed in the Bible as well. In Romans 6:15 it says, what then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law, but under grace? God forbid. Know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants ye are to whom ye obey, whether of sin unto death or obedience unto righteousness? So the question should not be, how much sin can we get away with and still be forgiven? The question should be, how can we obey the commandments of God? Also, it's a common objective, well, what about a divorce that happened a long time ago? This was, before I was converted to Christ, before I was baptized. Certainly, I've been forgiven, so that stuff doesn't matter anymore. Well, certainly when you come to Christ and you're washed of your sins, your past sins are forgiven, but your personal history is not erased. And this at issue is not sins of the past, but sins of the present and of the future. If you had a legitimate marriage in the past, that was no sin. But if you institute an illegitimate remarriage in the present and in the future, that is a continuing and willful sin. So it's not the same. Our personal history is not erased. If someone comes to Christ encumbered with various debts or legitimate obligations, they should not dishonor Christ by completely abdicating their responsibilities and acting as if their prior life history was rendered invalid. So the grace of God covers past sins done in ignorance, but not those willfully done knowingly. In Hebrews 10:26 it says, for if we sin willfully, after that we have received the knowledge of the truth, there remaineth no more sacrifice for sins, but a certain fearful looking for of judgment and fiery indignation, which shall devour the adversaries. Another thing people say is, well, this teaching is so unpopular, it must be wrong. I mean, nobody actually follows this. Well, if you were to look at Christian history with a broader bird's eye perspective, we see that in the past, most of Christendom, as the traditions carried by the Roman Catholic Church, did follow a teaching very similar to this, where divorce and remarriage was prohibited. So, of course, the Catholics don't do that anymore. They'll give you an annulment for any reason you want. They'll hand out annulments for nothing. But the point is, God has not left himself without a witness in history, and in the broader context of the entirety of Christian history, this sort of teaching has prevailed and has been common. So, in summary, the first reason for divorce is when a marriage is itself immoral. The second reason is when an unbeliever departs from a believer. There is no third legitimate reason. Remarriage is forbidden as long as the legitimate former spouse remains alive. A divorced person may be reconciled to their original spouse, unless they had remarried in the interim, or else they must remain unmarried. An unlawful marriage constitutes a perpetually adulterous estate and should be ended by divorce. Now this may seem harsh, but it is immutable. The law of God is everlasting. In Luke 16:17 it says, "And it is easier for heaven and earth to pass than one tittle of the law to fail. Whosoever putteth away his wife and marrieth another committeth adultery." So in the same breath, he's talking about the permanence of the law and the prohibition against remarriage. So these things are very much tied together. And some people, they can't handle this. They're like, well, what if this interpretation is wrong? I can't live without sex. I'll just die. Well, you can live without sex. Life is short, and hell is very hot. The warnings of judgment are very, very strong. Christ says in the Sermon on the Mount that it's better to mutilate yourself corporally than to suffer the punishments of hell. Matthew 5:27, he speaks in the context of the exposition of the prohibition against adultery. He says, "Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. It hath been said, Whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say unto you that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery." Now, I'm not saying that all remarried people are going to hell. I'm just saying that this is the warning that Christ gives in the context of the exposition on adultery. He's teaching about adultery, and he teaches, cut off your best member if need be to avoid hell. Anything is preferable to avoiding hell. This is a very harsh teaching, but it is the real teaching of Christ. So, this was considered very harsh to the disciples. The disciples say unto him, "If the case of the man be so with his wife, it is not good to marry." In Matthew 19:10, this is their response to his teaching. So, the disciples are seeking clarification on what seems like a very extreme position. They say, well, this is not good to marry. Now, at this point, Christ could have easily clarified and moderated his position. But instead, he takes an even further extreme tack, and he says, "But he said to them, All men cannot receive the same, save they to whom it is given. For there are some eunuchs which were so born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men. And there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it." Not a popular teaching indeed. Very extreme. He is recommending physical castration, which in the context of the verse itself is not just renounced marriage, as some versions will mistranslate it on purpose to avoid the implication. But, when he says they were born from their mother's womb, physically, and those who were made eunuchs of men were made so physically, and those who made themselves eunuchs were made so physically. And so this is similar to plucking out your right eye or casting away your right hand. So Christ recommends severing from yourself the offending body part, if at any cost, to avoid hell. So cutting off the offending body part can also be applied in the sense of cutting off your other half through divorce by severing an adulterous union, an illegitimate or second marriage. Also, another interpretation could be cutting off from the body of Christ the offending parts of those who are in a perpetually adulterous estate. This is an instance where church discipline is warranted. In 1 Corinthians 5:11, it says, But now I have written unto you not to keep company, if any man that is called a brother be a fornicator, or covetous, or an idolater, or a railer, or a drunkard, or an extortioner. With such a one, no, not to eat. For what have I to do to judge them that are without? Do not ye judge them that are within? But them that are without God judges. Therefore put away from yourself that wicked person. Now, of course I know that church discipline does not exist in this modern world. And if any salaried corporate employee pastor were to attempt to follow this teaching, he would have to find another career. He couldn't feed his family, because divorced and remarried persons are the pillars of the church, and they're the best tithers. So I know this isn't going to happen in real life, that Christian leaders cannot accept this responsibility, but it needs to be done. We need to respond and follow God's commandments, irrespective of the willingness of our leaders to accept this. So when compromise with sin, it affects the whole church and brings judgment from God. Action must be taken. Consider the example of Phinehas. When the people were committing whoredom with the daughters of Moab, and someone brought a woman into his tent in the sight of all the congregation, Phinehas took a javelin in his hand and ran them through. In Psalm 106:30 it says, Then stood up Phinehas and executed judgment, and so the plague was stayed. And that was counted unto him for righteousness unto all generations forevermore. So we should take action, even if others are hesitant or reluctant to do so. We should even rebuke public figures, regardless of the cost. John the Baptist was put in prison and later beheaded for rebuking Herod on this very issue of divorce and remarriage. In Matthew 14:3 it says, For Herod had laid hold on John and bound him and put him in prison for Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife. For John said unto him, It is not lawful for thee to have her. So rather than waiting for leadership to take action on this issue, we must take action at the grassroots, following the procedure that Christ laid out for dealing with sin in fellow Christians. In Matthew 18:15 he said, Moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. But if he will not hear thee, then take with thee one or two more, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he shall neglect to hear them, tell it unto the church. But if he neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as a heathen man and a publican. Verily I say unto you, whatsoever ye shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever ye shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven.